August 17, 1943, the port city of Messina, Sicily. General George S. Patton stood in his jeep, dust covering his boots, watching his 7th Army troops march into the city center. He had won the race. He had beaten Montgomery to Messina by just hours, driving his men relentlessly up Sicily's northern coast while Montgomery's 8th Army crawled up the eastern shore. Patton's face showed something between triumph and contempt. He knew Montgomery would arrive soon, and he wanted to be there when it happened. The next morning, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery drove into Messina, expecting to accept the surrender of Sicily's most important port. Instead, he found American flags flying and Patton's troops already dug in. Montgomery's face went rigid. His staff later described him as coldly furious. He barely acknowledged Patton's greeting. Within hours, Montgomery was back at his headquarters writing reports that emphasized the strategic importance of his advance while minimizing Patton's achievement. What happened in Messina wasn't just about two generals competing for glory. It was the beginning of a rivalry that would cost thousands of lives, delay the end of World War II, and nearly destroy the Anglo-American alliance. Within a year, Montgomery would be sabotaging Patton's operations. Within 18 months, German divisions would escape destruction because Montgomery refused to cooperate with American plans. Within 2 years, the rivalry would force Supreme Commander Eisenhower to choose between military efficiency and political survival. To understand how Montgomery's obsession with beating Patton became more important than beating the Germans, you need to understand who these men were and what they represented. Montgomery was Britain's most famous general, the hero of El Alamein, methodical, cautious, convinced of his own brilliance. He saw warfare as a science requiring careful preparation and overwhelming force. He believed the Americans were amateurs, brave but disorganized, lacking the sophistication of British military tradition. Patton was everything Montgomery despised, aggressive to the point of recklessness, profane, theatrical, and dangerously effective. Patton saw warfare as art and violence, requiring speed, shock, and the will to strike before the enemy was ready. He believed the British were exhausted, timid, living on the reputation of past glories. The two men represented not just different tactical philosophies, but different national characters, and after Sicily, they hated each other. The Sicily campaign revealed the pattern that would repeat for the next 2 years. Montgomery planned carefully, advanced methodically, and claimed credit lavishly. Patton improvised brilliantly, moved faster than anyone thought possible, and watched Montgomery steal his thunder. The British press celebrated Montgomery's steady professionalism. The American press celebrated Patton's daring advances. Both generals read the other's press coverage and seethed. But here's what made the rivalry dangerous. Montgomery wasn't just competing with Patton for glory. He was actively working to undermine Patton's operations, to deny him resources, to prevent him from achieving victories that might overshadow British contributions. Montgomery fought harder to stop Patton from succeeding than he fought to destroy German armies. And the Germans noticed. On August 23, 1943, 6 days after Messina fell, German intelligence officer Friedrich von Mellenthin wrote in his report about Allied command dysfunction. He noted that British and American forces were operating with minimal coordination, that their generals seemed more concerned with national prestige than military efficiency, that this disunity created opportunities for Germany. The rivalry that began at Messina would give Germany chances to escape, regroup, and prolong the war. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied forces stormed ashore in Normandy with Montgomery in overall command of ground forces. The plan called for rapid expansion of the beachhead, with British forces capturing the critical city of Caen within 24 hours, and American forces breaking out to the west. Montgomery's prestige rode on this plan. He had told everyone Caen would fall on D-Day. Caen didn't fall on D-Day, or D-Day +1, or D-Day +7. By mid-June, British forces were bogged down outside Caen, making minimal progress against determined German resistance.
Montgomery claimed this was intentional, that he was drawing German armor onto the British sector to enable American breakout in the West, but his staff knew the truth. Montgomery was stopped. His reputation was on the line, and he was scrambling to reframe failure as strategy.
On July 25th, while Montgomery was still grinding away at Caen, Patton's Third Army became operational in Normandy. Within 48 hours, Patton had broken through German defenses at Avranches. Within a week, he was racing across Brittany and southern Normandy. Within 2 weeks, he had advanced further than Montgomery had in 6. The contrast was devastating to Montgomery's reputation, and Montgomery knew it. Here's where it gets interesting. By early August 1944, the Allies had the German army in Normandy trapped. American forces had swept south and east. German units were caught in a pocket near Falaise, and the only escape route was a narrow gap between American and British-Canadian forces. If the Allies closed the Falaise Gap quickly, they could destroy 100,000 German troops and end the war months early. This required coordination between Montgomery's forces pushing south and American forces pushing north. Bradley's 12th Army Group was ready to close the gap from the south. He wanted to push his units north to Argentan and beyond, linking up with Canadian forces pushing south from Caen. This would trap the entire German 7th Army. But on August 13th, Montgomery sent orders that American forces were not to advance beyond Argentan. He claimed the boundary between British and American forces was fixed, that American advances beyond Argentan would create confusion and possible friendly fire incidents. Bradley was stunned. His forces could close the gap in 24 hours. German divisions were in chaos, retreating in panic. This was the chance to destroy Hitler's army in France, and Montgomery was ordering him to stop? Bradley called Eisenhower. Eisenhower called Montgomery. Montgomery refused to change the boundary. He insisted Canadian forces would close the gap from the north. He said American forces would just get in the way. The Canadians didn't close the gap from the north, not on August 13th, not on August 14th. Montgomery's forces advanced slowly, carefully, methodically. The gap stayed open, and through that gap poured the remnants of the German 7th Army. Tens of thousands of German soldiers escaped, including the experienced cadres and officers who would form the core of German defenses for the next 9 months. Tanks, vehicles, and equipment that should have been captured were driven east to fight again. By August 21st, when the Falaise Gap finally closed, over 40,000 German troops had escaped. Another 10,000 to 15,000 had been killed and 50,000 captured, but the professionals, the veterans, the men who knew how to fight, many of them got away. Bradley later wrote in his memoir that the Falaise Gap was his greatest disappointment of the war. He believed Montgomery had deliberately delayed closing the gap to ensure British forces got credit for the final victory, even if it meant letting Germans escape. Patton was more direct in his assessment. He wrote in his diary on August 15th, "The British are deliberately letting the Germans escape to prevent us from winning the battle. Montgomery would rather see the war last another year than let an American army get the glory of destroying the Wehrmacht in France." Patton's language was cruder in private conversations with his staff. He called Montgomery a tired little fart and worse. German commanders who escaped through the Falaise Gap later confirmed that the slow Allied closing of the pocket had saved their armies. General Hans Eberbach, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army, wrote after the war that he expected to be trapped and captured by August 14th. Instead, he was able to organize a fighting withdrawal through the gap that Montgomery's slow advance had left open. Those escaped forces would soon be defending Germany's borders. September 1944. The Allies were racing across France. Patton's Third Army was advancing so fast that his supply lines couldn't keep up.
He was running out of fuel. His tanks were stopping because there was no gasoline, not because the Germans were stopping them. Patton's staff calculated they needed 400,000 gallons of fuel per day to maintain their advance. They were getting less than half that. At the same time, Montgomery was pushing Eisenhower for his own plan, Operation Martin Garden. Montgomery wanted to drop 3 airborne divisions into Holland to capture bridges over the Rhine, then drive British armored forces 64 miles through German-held territory to cross the Rhine at Arnhem. It was the most ambitious operation Montgomery had ever proposed. It was also exactly the kind of risky, aggressive plan that Montgomery had always criticized Americans for attempting. Here's the thing. Martin Garden required massive logistics support. It needed transport aircraft, supplies, fuel, and Eisenhower's full backing. Montgomery demanded priority for all resources flowing into the European theater. He argued that a concentrated thrust into Germany could end the war by Christmas, but that meant denying those resources to other Allied armies. Specifically, it meant denying them to Patton.
Patton wasn't at the meeting. If he had been, there might have been violence. When Bradley told him afterward what Montgomery had proposed, Patton exploded. He told Bradley that with just 1 week of proper supply, he could be across the Rhine and into Germany. He said Montgomery's plan was designed not to win the war, but to ensure that British forces got credit for winning it. He accused Montgomery of sabotaging American operations out of jealousy and ego. Bradley's diary entry from September 3, 1944 is revealing. He wrote, "Monty is terrified that Patton will beat him into Germany. Everything he proposes is designed to stop Patton's advance, not to stop the Germans. If Monty spent half the energy fighting the Wehrmacht that he spends fighting Patton, the war would already be over." Eisenhower made his decision. He gave Montgomery approval for Market Garden and the logistics priority to launch it. Patton's Third Army would go on limited rations. The fuel would go north. Montgomery would get his chance. What happened next vindicated every criticism Patton and Bradley had made. Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944. It was a disaster. The British 1st Airborne Division was destroyed at Arnhem. The armored advance stalled after capturing just 1 bridge. The operation failed to achieve any of its objectives. Montgomery had demanded all available resources, gotten them, and failed spectacularly. Meanwhile, Patton sat 40 miles from the Rhine with empty fuel tanks, watching Montgomery waste the logistics capacity that could have put American forces into Germany 2 months earlier. The Market Garden failure should have ended Montgomery's credibility. Instead, he blamed everyone else. He claimed the intelligence was faulty, the weather was bad, the resistance was unexpectedly strong. He never acknowledged that his plan had been overambitious and poorly executed, and he immediately began planning his next operation, one that would again require priority over American armies. But here's what Montgomery didn't know. German commanders were reading Allied disagreements like an open book. On September 25th, after Market Garden's failure, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt wrote to his staff that Allied command dysfunction was Germany's greatest strategic asset. He noted that British and American armies were competing rather than cooperating, that resources were being allocated based on political considerations rather than military opportunity, and that this chaos was giving Germany time to rebuild its defenses. German intelligence had intercepted communications revealing the fuel allocation disputes. They knew Patton had been stopped for lack of supplies, not German resistance. They knew Montgomery's operation had drained resources from other sectors. Von Rundstedt ordered his staff to focus defensive preparations on Montgomery's sector, calculating correctly that Eisenhower's political need to support British prestige meant Montgomery would get priority for future operations, regardless of military logic. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. We've already discussed how Montgomery's press conference after the battle nearly destroyed the Allied command. But what the press conference didn't reveal was how Montgomery had operated during the battle itself.
Eisenhower had given him temporary command of American forces north of the German penetration. Montgomery used that authority not just to coordinate the defense, but to undermine Patton's relief operation from the south. On December 28, 1944, with Patton driving into the southern flank of the German Bulge, Montgomery proposed that all American forces withdraw to more defensible positions. He suggested giving up hard-won ground to shorten supply lines and consolidate defenses. Patton was 20 miles from cutting off the entire German offensive, and Montgomery wanted to retreat. Bradley refused to even forward Montgomery's proposal to his army commanders. He knew it was designed to make Patton's advance irrelevant. Montgomery's staff later claimed he was being prudent, preparing for the possibility that the German offensive might break through again. But the German offensive was already defeated by December 28th. The weather had cleared, Allied air power was devastating German columns, and Patton was crushing the southern flank. Montgomery's retreat proposal would have prolonged the battle and increased casualties for no military benefit. It would, however, have made Montgomery's defensive role appear more important than Patton's offensive role. January 1945. The Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine and invade Germany. Montgomery insisted that his 21st Army Group should make the main effort, with American armies playing supporting roles. He argued that British forces were better trained for the difficult river-crossing operation. He demanded priority for landing craft, bridging equipment, and air support. He got it. Montgomery scheduled his Rhine crossing, Operation Plunder, on March 23, 1945. He spent weeks stockpiling supplies and preparing elaborate plans. He issued detailed orders for the crossing. He invited Winston Churchill and the press to witness his triumph. This would be Montgomery's vindication after Market Garden.
This would prove British military superiority. This would show the Americans how a proper operation should be conducted. On March 22, 1945, the night before Montgomery's scheduled crossing, George Patton drove his Third Army across the Rhine at Oppenheim. He did it without air support, without elaborate preparation, without landing craft or special equipment. He used boats his engineers had scrounged locally. By dawn on March 23, Patton had 2 divisions across the Rhine and was expanding his bridgehead against minimal German resistance. Patton called Bradley at 10 p.m. on March 22. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across," Patton said. "We crossed at 2200 hours. We caught them by surprise. No air support, no artillery preparation, just straight across. Tell Montgomery I'm sorry I stole his thunder." Montgomery later wrote that he could hear Patton grinning through the telephone. When Montgomery learned that Patton had crossed the Rhine before him, his reaction was volcanic. His chief of staff, Francis de Gangon, later described Montgomery as more upset by Patton's crossing than by any German attack. Montgomery immediately called Eisenhower and demanded that Patton's bridgehead be given no additional resources or publicity. He insisted that plunder was the main effort, and Patton's crossing was a minor affair that shouldn't distract from the British achievement. The press saw it differently. American newspapers ran headlines, "Patton crosses Rhine," "Third Army beats British into Germany," "Patton does it again." British newspapers were more restrained, but couldn't ignore the story. Montgomery had spent weeks preparing a set-piece operation. Patton had improvised a crossing overnight and beaten him by 24 hours. The contrast was humiliating. Montgomery's March 23rd crossing was textbook perfect. Massive artillery preparation, air support, landing craft bringing troops across in organized waves, airborne divisions dropping behind German lines. It was everything a military academy would teach about river crossing operations. It also took place after Patton had already demonstrated that such elaborate preparations weren't necessary. The Germans had already been surprised. The Rhine was already breached. Montgomery's perfect operation was irrelevant. April 1945. The war was ending. Allied armies were driving into the heart of Germany from all directions. The question now wasn't whether Germany would be defeated, but who would get credit for defeating it. Montgomery wanted Berlin.
He argued that British forces should drive straight for the German capital and accept Hitler's surrender. He told Eisenhower that letting the Russians take Berlin would be a political disaster that the West would regret for decades. Eisenhower disagreed. He decided that American armies would focus on southern Germany, while British armies cleared northern Germany and Denmark. Berlin would be left to the Soviets, who were already closer and had paid a higher price in blood to get there. Eisenhower's decision was based on military logic and political agreements made at Yalta. It was also based on something he didn't say publicly, his complete loss of confidence in Montgomery's judgment. Montgomery spent the final weeks of the war writing reports that emphasized British contributions and minimized American achievements. He claimed that his forces had faced the toughest German resistance. He argued that his methodical approach had been vindicated by events. He positioned himself as the senior Allied commander who had guided the campaign from Normandy to victory, and he completely rewrote the narrative of every operation where Patton had outperformed him. On May 4, 1945, German forces in northern Germany surrendered to Montgomery. 3 days later, on May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally to all Allied forces. The war in Europe was over. Montgomery had his victory, but he never stopped fighting his war against Patton's reputation. In his post-war memoirs published in 1958, Montgomery described the Falaise Gap as a brilliant Allied operation that he had coordinated. He made no mention of the controversy over the boundary between British and American forces. He didn't mention that Bradley had wanted to close the gap days earlier. He certainly didn't mention that thousands of German troops had escaped because of his delays. In Montgomery's version, Falaise was a triumph of planning and coordination. Montgomery's Marden Garden was described as a 90% success that had failed only because of unexpected German strength and bad weather. He didn't acknowledge that the operation had been overambitious. He didn't mention that he had demanded resources that could have been used more effectively elsewhere. He portrayed Marden Garden as a bold plan that almost worked, not as the disaster that Bradley and Patton knew it to be. Montgomery's Rhine crossing was described as the decisive operation that broke German defenses and opened the way into Germany. He mentioned Patton's crossing at Oppenheim in a single sentence, calling it a small-scale affair that had been unimportant to the overall campaign. He made it sound like Patton had crossed a stream while Montgomery had conquered the Rhine. Patton never got to write his memoirs. He died in a car accident in December 1945, 7 months after the war ended. He was 60 years old. His death meant Montgomery's version of events went largely unchallenged for years. British historians repeated Montgomery's claims. The narrative that emerged in the 1950s and early 1960s portrayed Montgomery as the steady professional and Patton as the brilliant but reckless cowboy who needed Montgomery's guidance.
It wasn't until American archives were opened and Bradley's memoirs were published that the full story of the Montgomery-Patton rivalry emerged. Montgomery's book, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951, was diplomatic but clear. Montgomery had fought harder to maintain British prestige than to defeat Germans efficiently. Montgomery had sabotaged American operations out of jealousy. Montgomery had prolonged the war by months because he couldn't bear to let Patton achieve victories that overshadowed British contributions. Other American commanders were less diplomatic. General James Gavin, who commanded the 82nd Airborne Division, later wrote that Montgomery's ego had cost thousands of American lives. General Troy Middleton, who commanded 8th Corps, described Montgomery as more concerned with headlines than with winning battles. General Lucian Truscott wrote that Montgomery's press conference after the Battle of the Bulge had been the most disgraceful performance by a senior Allied commander in the entire war. British officers who served under Montgomery were even more damaging. Major General Francis de Gingand, Montgomery's chief of staff, later admitted that Montgomery had been obsessed with Patton and had made operational decisions based on rivalry rather than military logic.
Brigadier Edgar Williams, Montgomery's intelligence chief, confirmed that Montgomery had manipulated intelligence reports to justify decisions that had already been made for political reasons. The historical consensus that emerged by the 1970s was clear. Montgomery had been a competent general who won important victories at El Alamein and in Normandy. But from Sicily onward, his obsession with competing against Patton had compromised his judgment and damaged Allied operations. The Falaise Gap should have been closed a week earlier. Market Garden should never have been launched. Resources wasted on Montgomery's prestige projects could have ended the war months sooner. Modern historians estimate that Montgomery's rivalry with Patton extended World War II in Europe by at least 3 months, possibly longer. The German troops who escaped at Falaise formed the core of defenses that held up Allied advances in autumn 1944. The resources wasted on Market Garden could have supplied Patton's drive to the Rhine in September. The delays Montgomery caused in coordinating the final offensives into Germany gave Hitler time to prolong the war into May 1945. 3 months might not sound like much, but in those 3 months, tens of thousands of additional soldiers died. Concentration camps continued operating. Cities continued to be bombed. The human cost of Montgomery's ego was measured in lives that could have been saved if the war had ended in February 1945 instead of May. The real tragedy is that Montgomery never understood what he had done. He died in 1976 at age 88, still convinced that he had been the greatest Allied general of World War II. He still believed that his methodical approach had been superior to Patton's aggression. He still believed that the Americans had been amateurs who needed British guidance. He never acknowledged that his rivalry with Patton cost lives and prolonged the war. Eisenhower understood. In private conversations after the war, Eisenhower told friends that managing Montgomery had been harder than managing the German threat. He said Montgomery's insecurity and ego had nearly destroyed the alliance multiple times. He admitted that his biggest mistake as Supreme Commander had been not confronting Montgomery earlier and more directly about his obstruction of American operations. Churchill understood too. In his private papers, later published, Churchill wrote that Montgomery's behavior toward American commanders had been shameful and dangerous. Churchill noted that Britain's survival depended on American support, and Montgomery's contempt for American generals had risked that support. Churchill wrote that he spent more time managing Montgomery's damage to Anglo-American relations than any other aspect of the alliance. Bradley understood best of all. In his later years, Bradley was asked what single change would have shortened World War II. His answer was immediate: give Eisenhower the authority to fire Montgomery. Bradley explained that every major delay in Allied operations from August 1944 onward had been caused by Montgomery's refusal to cooperate with American plans or Montgomery's demands for resources to support his own ego-driven operations. The evidence from German sources is the most damning. After the war, captured German commanders were interviewed extensively about Allied operations. Again and again, they mentioned Allied command dysfunction as a major advantage for Germany. Field Marshal von Rundstedt said that the Allies had coordinated their advances in autumn 1944. Germany couldn't have held them. General Heinz Guderian said that Allied logistics disputes had given Germany time to prepare defenses that should have been overrun. General Siegfried Westphal, who served as Chief of Staff to von Rundstedt, was even more specific. He said German intelligence had identified the rivalry between Montgomery and Patton by September 1944 and had planned defenses accordingly. Westphal explained that Germany had concentrated its best remaining divisions against Montgomery's sector because German commanders knew that Eisenhower's political constraints meant Montgomery would always get priority. Meanwhile, they used second-rate divisions against Patton, knowing that Patton would be starved for supplies regardless of his success.
This is the most damning evidence of all. The Germans deliberately exploited the Montgomery-Patton rivalry. They used Allied disunity as a defensive strategy. They survived longer because Montgomery fought harder against Patton than against the Wehrmacht. German commanders after the war essentially confirmed what Patton had written in his diary. Montgomery would rather prolong the war than let Americans win it. Why did Montgomery do it? The easy answer is ego. Montgomery was insecure beneath his arrogant exterior. He needed to be recognized as the greatest general of the war. He couldn't tolerate anyone, especially an American, achieving victories that overshadowed his own. Every time Patton succeeded, it diminished Montgomery's reputation. So Montgomery worked to ensure Patton couldn't succeed. But there's a deeper answer. Montgomery represented Britain's declining power. Britain had fought since 1939, had endured the Blitz, had stood alone against Hitler for a year. British soldiers had fought in North Africa, Italy, and France. Britain had paid an enormous price in blood and treasure. And now, the Americans, who had only entered the war in 1941, were providing most of the men and material for the final victory. Montgomery couldn't accept that Britain was becoming the junior partner. He couldn't accept that American generals were achieving victories that British generals couldn't. He couldn't accept that the war would be won primarily by American power, not British skill. So he fought to maintain British prestige, even when it meant sabotaging military operations, even when it meant prolonging the war, even when it meant more soldiers dying. Montgomery fought harder against Patton than against the Germans because Patton represented everything Montgomery couldn't bear to acknowledge, that American energy, resources, and aggressive tactics were more decisive than British experience and careful planning, that the balance of power had shifted, that Britain's moment as the dominant military power was ending, that the Americans were taking over. The rivalry between Montgomery and Patton was ultimately about more than two generals competing for glory. It was about the end of the British Empire and the rise of American power. It was about national pride and historical change. Montgomery fought against Patton because he was fighting against history itself, against the reality that Britain's era was ending and America's was beginning. But Montgomery couldn't stop history, and his attempts to do so cost thousands of lives, prolonged World War II, and damaged the alliance that Britain desperately needed. In trying to preserve British prestige, Montgomery undermined British interests. In trying to limit American success, he made American power more obvious. In fighting Patton harder than he fought the Germans, Montgomery lost both battles. On December 9, 1945, 3 days before Patton's fatal car accident, the two men saw each other for the last time in a ceremony in Luxembourg. They didn't speak. Patton stood with American officers on one side of the square. Montgomery stood with British officers on the other. The symbolism was perfect. Two allies who had fought separate wars, unable to cooperate even in victory. A staff officer who was present later recalled that Patton looked at Montgomery with something between contempt and pity. Montgomery looked at Patton and looked away, as if Patton didn't exist. Even then, even after the war was won, the rivalry continued. Even then, Montgomery couldn't acknowledge what everyone else knew, that Patton had been the better general, had achieved more with less, had understood warfare in ways Montgomery never could. The lesson of the Montgomery-Patton rivalry isn't about tactics or strategy. It's about ego and insecurity. Montgomery had the resources of the British Empire behind him, the prestige of El Alamein, the support of Churchill, and the authority of his position. But he was so insecure, so desperate for recognition, so terrified of being overshadowed that he fought against his own allies harder than against his enemies. Montgomery spent more energy undermining Patton than defeating Germans because he was more afraid of Patton's success than of German resistance. He delayed operations to prevent Patton from achieving victories. He demanded resources to launch ego-driven operations while Patton sat idle for lack of fuel. He manipulated press coverage and wrote false histories to claim credit he didn't deserve. And thousands of soldiers died because one general couldn't tolerate another general's success.
In the end, Montgomery got what he wanted. He received every honor Britain could bestow. He became Viscount Montgomery of El Alamein. He became chief of the Imperial General Staff. He was celebrated as Britain's greatest general since Wellington. But he died knowing that history was rewriting his legacy, that documents were emerging proving his obstruction of American operations, that his rivalry with Patton was being exposed as the petty and deadly distraction it had been. Montgomery fought the wrong enemy, and he lost.